Erel Margalit is the head of the Cybersecurity Task Force for the Israeli Knesset. He's also founder of Jerusalem Venture Partners, which launched lots of interesting cybersecurity companies over the last decade or so. Next to him is Bruce Rubin. Andrew Rubin. Bruce Rubin was my roommate in college. Andrew Rubin is the CEO of Illumio, which is a Silicon Valley-based Axel Partners funded global security firm with clients all over the world, including France and Europe. Isabelle Falque-Pierrotin, done well, okay, is the head of CNIL, which is the data protection organization of the French government, as well as being chairwoman of all the CNILs of 28 European countries, so she has a pan-European view. And last but not least, my old Newsweek colleague, Chris Dickey, who is now Global Affairs Editor at the Daily Beast, and he'll be leading the charge here. But first, Erel is going to come up and give a quick talk about an interesting project he's involved with, and then we'll go back to discussion. So thank you all.
Do we have our presentation, Emmanuel? Thank you. In a minute, I will talk a little bit about cyber warfare, but I wanted to say a few personal notes after some terrible events back home in Israel as both a father and two daughters and a man of the world. Yesterday, a guy that was influenced very much by social networks at the age of 17 got into a village where a young girl by the name of Hilal Ariel was sleeping. And she was sleeping so calmly, so beautifully, yet he took a knife and stabbed her many, many times and times again, until she died. And then in that occasion, it influenced many others on the social networks, and when his Facebook page was checked, you saw that a lot of what he did was influenced by other people that were training him on the network how to commit a murder. And the other terror attacks was done in the same way just a few hours later, where that act inspired many others to go and do the same. The very same people that liked that terror attack in Tel Aviv or in Israel are the same ones that did the like on the terror attacks in Paris and in Brussels and in London or in Orlando. And what I'm saying is that if we are to work together against terror, we need to work in full coordination, because when terrorist organizations or individuals are finding their way through technology, the horror can be large, sometimes very large, and I'm calling for international cooperation around cybersecurity, but also on the fight against terror. And so when we talk about cyber threats, I come from the business world. Many times we talk about companies, about banks, about certain civilian organizations that can be threatened, and we often see it as a business endeavor. One of my companies that I was involved with, CyberArk, was doing it primarily for the financial sector. But during the last few months and years, we're seeing that the cyber threat, if not careful and if friendly democratic states are not cooperating, can become a cyber war, and I'm not exaggerating. The deadliest war in history it could be if we're not careful and if we're not doing what we need to be doing in order to protect ourselves against rogue states or terrorist organizations that are now using technology to attack countries and individuals. So you think of weapons as guns or tanks or airplanes, but the most deadliest weapon is this. This could be the deadliest weapons in the next generation of wars around the world if we're not careful and if friendly countries are not working with each other. And many people thought about one hacker, but you can think about a group of hackers. You can think about an army of hackers. You can think about countries that are using armies and armies of hackers, using billions of dollars in order to penetrate organizations, sometimes civilian organizations, not countries, but the civilian business organizations which are taken over and then used to attack the state. And so what is it that we can do about it, and how dangerous is it? Well, if you think about it, you talked about Brexit here in Europe. Well, I can tell you that you may have a Brexit on the economic side, but Europe and the UK cannot have a Brexit on the security side, because a security Brexit between Europe and Britain could lead to one of the bloodiest occurrences and wars in Europe on European soils. And together we stand as European countries and in friendly countries around the world, but divided we fall, because a lot of the terrorists are not attacking by borders. You all know about hijackers hijacking a plane and causing the September 11th occurrence. But let me tell you something that's much more worrying. If Europe and the UK don't work together, and a group of hackers will actually, and these are the plane movements, they can only penetrate Heathrow, which has 1,054 flights per day, and there's over 30,000 flights over Europe per day, and just not blow any plane up, just change the coordinates of the flights by a fraction, and what you will have is you will have over Europe a variety of planes instead of going by each other, hitting each other, and you can have the deadliest occurrence in the skies over Europe if the hackers are successful and if you're not careful. Just a few months ago in Germany, a group of hackers were able to penetrate the thermometer of a big furnace in a steel mill, not letting it cool and causing one of the biggest explosions after a meltdown occurred. The same thing can happen in nuclear civilian facilities over Europe. How many are there over Europe? Do you know the number? There's about 65. And among them, some of them are old, and their defense system is very problematic. And so all you need to do is be able to penetrate the temperature and cause a meltdown in 3 of them, and what you will have is major disaster over the soil of Europe. And some of it you can do through the UK or through elsewhere without needing to penetrate any new networks. Dragonfly was one of the deadliest attacks on pharmaceutical companies across Europe by a group of Russian hackers that all they wanted to do is steal the IP from a lot of these pharmaceutical companies. Well, what if they didn't just steal the IP, but change the chemical makeup of some of these drugs in a way that would be undetectable? What you can have is you can have the cyber plague over Europe if some of these drugs are manipulated in a way that is causing people to swallow poison instead of real drugs. And Sandworm was an attack by the Russians on the Ukraine in the deadly winter, where 255,000 homes did not have electricity, and so many people that were dependent on key elements and key issues died because they didn't have the electricity and the provided care. That can be done in a way that could be very harmful. So what am I saying? Both on terror and also on cyber terror, we need to act now. And by acting, I mean we need to take measures between different countries in order to create a public-private partnership with each of the country creating a CERT. A national CERT is a cyber war defender, where each of these CERTs will have in the civilian capacity things like banking and retail and utilities and infrastructure and automotive and airlines and a variety of verticals that need to work together among themselves and with governments. But more than that, if we're going to be able to protect ourselves, then what we need is, and that's what I'm calling for, is a combination of certs across Europe, across the United States, across Israel, maybe some other friendly countries that want to join the club of democracy and being able to defend and work together, because that hacker, which is penetrating one bank in the Netherlands, is using the same worm to penetrate the other bank in the other part in Paris or in Tel Aviv or in New York or in other places as well. So what I'm calling for is I'm calling to work together, country by country, business with governments, in order to protect the network and to keep it a safe place, because if we're not careful, the network leads to physical damage in a big way by those countries or those organizations that are using it in order to try and cause major havoc around the world, and we know that they're trying. Together we stand, divided we will fall, and that's the cause for working together between countries, between business and governments, and between the civilians and the civil liberties, and the need for national and global security. Thank you.
Thank you, Erel, for that apocalyptic vision. Well, we all know the apocalypse is possible now, and that probably cyber warfare could be used to bring it about. Which brings us back to something that we were talking about in the green room, in the waiting area here, which is this is the most potent form of asymmetric warfare that's ever existed. You were talking about groups of hackers. We're not talking about huge numbers of people there. We're not talking, in many cases, we're not talking about state terror. We're talking about individuals and small groups who can literally wreak havoc in civilized countries and in uncivilized and in less civilized and less developed countries. So I think that's one of the things I'd like to look at today. But when you were talking at the beginning of your remarks, I was struck by the simplicity of some of this. That terrible murder in Israel, that was not wildly sophisticated. That was sort of the equivalent of using box cutters to hijack jets. You have an enormous impact with very simple tools. These murderers were groomed on Facebook. We're all on Facebook. Lots of kids are on Facebook. They can be groomed, and you don't need a vast, sophisticated network. So we come to this question: how do you start to protect people from Facebook? How do you protect them from basic communications in the cyber age? How do you deal with a situation where, on the one hand, we can have all this government and public-private cooperation and coordination, but then you have a lot of individuals who say, you're interfering in my life. That's what we saw with the whole Snowden, all the Snowden revelations. So, Isabelle, you're in charge of data security here in Europe, and you're the president of the CNIL here in France. You have overall responsibilities and relationships dealing with Europe. This is a country that believes in government controls and government limits. A lot of countries don't believe in that, but France does. How does France try to address the kinds of problems that we're talking about in terms of data security? What can you do to make people's data secure, but also to stop terrorists, to stop anarchists from creating havoc here in France and in Europe?
Well, I'm going to answer your question, but I want first to react to the first speaker, because he gave us a very, as you say, apocalyptic vision with offensive from certain actors against states or against companies. And he's right. But I think the problem maybe is even more complex, because in fact, we are generically entering into the digital society, then that is, it's in itself not a danger, but fragile. In other words, this digital society is a society of interconnected world, of interconnection, and through that, we're all in relationship with others through data. So it means that if a part of this society is weak, the whole system is weak. So it's not only a question of offensive of certain people, of certain entities, it is the whole system that has to be rethink, you see? And security has to be thought, I would say, differently in this world in which data is everywhere, shared by everybody, and in which it's rather easy to have data leaks. So I think the question is, how do we make sure that at each point of the system there is a security culture that makes sure that the industry, the end user, the public entities, everyone is aware of the possible consequences of a disclosure. You see what I mean?
I see what you mean, but can a government do that? How does a government do that?
No, I think the government itself, by himself, could not solve the entire question. This is really a collective responsibility, and I'm chairing the CNIL, that is Data Protection Authority, and what I think is that we need to work with all the parts of the chain. So it's the responsibility of the government is to make sure that every part of this chain, of this security chain, is aware of the new world and is aware of the new responsibilities that we all share, okay? And that we have the good reflexes, that we have the good security tools and everything. But it's not the government who is going to maintain the whole security of the system itself, you see? Not by himself, not alone.
So do you see the government role as education or regulation or both?
Both. I think we have education responsibility, and at the CNIL we are issuing a lot of education programs. We have also regulation. For instance, we are conducting roughly 500 inspections a year. In 95% of these inspections, there is a security issue. So it means that the data controllers that we are visiting, they are not at the right level in terms of security. So in fact, they are facing the possibility of sanctions, you see. But regulation can be a tool, but you can't bring a complete answer to this new environment in which data is everywhere, and therefore there is everywhere a potential risk of data disclosure if you only rely on regulation. You need to have other tools to push, you see?
I think that's sort of where Andrew is in this conversation. You are developing tools that are specifically about answering these problems. I'm not sure if they're in the framework of regulation or outside the framework of regulation, but we were talking about it backstage. How do you protect these companies or these government entities that have such vast, complex networks and maybe 1 million backdoors to those networks nobody knows about?
Sure, absolutely. So I think you have to start by acknowledging the problem. Most people don't realize it, but 90% of the data that exists in the world today was created in the last 2 years. And if you think about that from a cyber perspective, before we worry about how we protect ourselves, start thinking about how much surface area of attack we're creating every day. It's not growing linearly, it's not even growing exponentially, it's now growing parabolically. And as a result of creating so much attack surface, you end up in a situation where it is asymmetric. The attackers actually have the advantage over the defenders because they have so much to go after. There's an expression in cyber that attackers think in graphs and defenders think in lists. And the premise of the expression is very simple, that the attackers look at everything and how all these things are connected, whereas we try and protect things by writing lists of things that we should and shouldn't do. And the attacker inherently has the advantage as a result. What we believe very strongly is that in order to protect something like cyber surface area, you have to acknowledge that security actually has two missions. For a very long time in the cyber landscape, security only had one mission. And people who participate in the industry, such as us, only sold products to governments and enterprises to solve one problem: protect things and keep them safe. And the measure of success or failure was if things remained safe, if breaches didn't take place, we were doing our job well. When a breach occurred, we failed, and we failed in an absolute sense. That premise is no longer true in 2016. Security now has two missions, and we're taking a page from the physical world in this sense. The first job will always be to attempt safety. Ideally, we'd love to prevent every breach. We'd love to stop every bad thing from happening. It's not realistic any longer. Security now has a second job, which is to reduce the surface area of attack. And as a result of doing that well, when a breach does take place, it's very much like a bomb going off. Your goal is to reduce the blast radius in the event that you can't prevent it from detonating. And security and many of the tools that are being built today and many of the motions that are actually being regulated, regulation does have a piece of this story, are now designed to work through that second mission. How do we make it more difficult for an attacker to get to the highest value assets? How do we make it more difficult for them to penetrate the most critical infrastructure or critical pieces of an enterprise? But in the event that they are successful in a breach, how do we make sure that the blast radius is as small as possible? And that's a motion that never existed before today, and it's something that I think you're going to find in a lot of ways becomes the biggest piece of the cybersecurity motion going forward.
When I said public-private partnership, I think there's three levels to security attacks. One can be 80% of the attacks could be solved by proper regulation on two levels. One is the robustness of the system. So if you have regulation or requirements that people like Isabelle are responsible for certain products or certain tools that you should be using, then a lot of things will be prevented if you're putting your commerce out there on the net. Two is resilience, because you need to assume an attack. How resilient is the network? If it's a utility network, if it's a data network, how can it go around the area that was attacked? The third is really country attack or a terrorist attack on a global scale, which then requires government intervention. One of the ideas of creating a CERT is that the governments are creating the conduit for the banking industry to work and regulate itself, for the airlines industry to work and regulate itself, and to be able to share information about those intruders that are coming from one angle, that if you share the information, you don't need to compromise your own data. You can be able to intercept them on another place, because every attack has its DNA. And one of the interesting things to see that technologically, once you break the DNA of a virus or of a Trojan horse or of an attack, you're able to intercept it much more easily on another side of the network, but you need to be able to anticipate it.
Well, that brings me actually to something you wanted to say about that, Isabelle? That brings me to another element in this whole debate that I think is interesting, which is if we were talking about classic warfare, trying to stop an enemy, you have defense, you have the possibility of offense, and you have deterrence. Well, what's the deterrence for hackers? What can you do to them that will make them not do the things that they want to do to us? Is there a means of deterrence? Is there a way to get at them? Or are we going to be victimized by them like we've been victimized by the proliferation of Islamic terrorists, for instance? What can you do?
So I think one of the things you have to realize is that it's not a bucket of attackers. There's actually many different buckets, and they have different motivations. And so in some cases, there's no doubt that deterrence is possible. In others, it's probably not, no matter what you do or say to them. But I think one thing that's universal across the entire attack landscape is that as you make it more expensive or more difficult to achieve success, in a lot of ways, people will move on. In other words, if you look at a building in a large city and that building has incredible security, it's probably very important. It's probably a high-value asset and, of course, a high-value target as well. But the stronger and more visible the security is, the least likely it is that somebody will go directly after it, especially if their motivation is not specific to that particular building. They'll look and they'll say, this is going to be more work, it's going to be more expense, it's riskier, and it's more likely I'll fail. In a lot of ways, we sort of forgot that lesson in the cyber world. If you look at a large enterprise, let's say a large financial services institution, If you were to actually look inside of their data centers, inside of all the applications and all the databases that are critical to running that organization, the reality is that until very recently, we treated and protected everything the same. Even though the application that counts how many cups of coffee are consumed inside of the bank sits right next to the one that does the trading and next to the one that has our information in it. But our protection methodology and our strategy was to sort of spread the protection evenly. We don't do that in the physical world. We figure out what are our highest value assets and targets, and we massively overinvest in protecting them. So some of these strategies and motions that we've used for a very long time in the real world, we're going to have to adapt them, we're going to have to adopt them in the cyber world. And I think some of the strategies that you're going to see are going to make it more difficult and more expensive to access some of these very valuable data stores that people tend to go after. And today they have all too easy a time getting to them.
Well, that seems to make sense. Is that what you're doing, Isabelle? Is that what you're encouraging business to do?
No, I just want to react to the idea that, of course, we need to have new tools and new reaction, new regulation answers to the new situation. But at the same time, we have to provide the citizens and the consumers with the belief that these new regulation tools, these new laws, this new environment is not going to endanger its own liberties. Because if he doesn't believe, if he really believes it is the case, there is also a risk of side behaviors of the individuals that could endanger also the security of the whole system. Remember what happened after the Snowden revelation in July 2013. Within a month, the traffic on very deep levels of the internet increased. Because people were afraid of what was said by Snowden, and they were afraid of the sort of mass surveillance. So if on behalf...
I mean, they moved on to the darknet, basically.
Yeah, the darknet, yes. So what I want to say is that obviously we need a higher cybersecurity. Therefore, we need new tools and new regulation. But this should not be done without the individuals and without providing the individuals with new guarantees, because it could endanger, paradoxically, the robustness of the whole system if, in other words, if the individuals doesn't buy out the new system, and if therefore it develops side behaviors and hidden behaviors that would be very difficult to control.
Yes, I agree with Isabelle, and I think that the big brother scenario for cybersecurity in the longer term is not going to work. And because when you have a metaphor where the state or a state controls the information, the privacy of the individual, the democratic rights of the individual, it's just not going to work, on one hand. On the other hand, society needs to be able to protect itself against those that are trying to harm it. So what is done in the banking area when you want to transfer money? It used to be that you need to go through one system. Now there's a new system that's called blockchain. It's a system that evaluates the network to evaluate who's dangerous and who's not, but not through one approving organization. It's sort of it's a security card, but through different elements in the network. It's just like, how do you set a price of a Bitcoin? It's set spontaneously on all the points of the network that the Bitcoin is being used. One of the things that I'm pushing for with a number of developers around the world is how to have a democratic evaluation of danger in the system that is not necessarily run by the state, but is run by individuals that are seeing danger and are doing it in a way that's sort of a social way of doing it, protecting the rights of the individuals and also defending them. You can think of people that really will want to use it are refugees. What's happening with refugees? Refugees are going, let's say they're leaving Syria, they're in Amman, they're in Jordan or somewhere, and they're moving to a place in Europe. If they don't have an identity, everybody thinks, well, maybe this person is dangerous, this person is dangerous. While if you had a social identity card that was not evaluated by a state
but was spontaneously created, especially when those that are trying to breach it are being alerted, then people can know who you are in a very comfortable manner, or at least know that you're not one of the people that have been trying to harm society in one place or another, because a few people around the world are causing the rest of society, the open society, to be crazy, to be paranoid, to be completely stressed, when if you had a way to monitor, to alert, it could be a lot calmer for all the rest.
What do you think of that idea, Andrew? Think that would work?
I think one of the challenges that you're going to have is figuring out how to not game a system that's effectively relying on identity. In other words, when you talk to organizations, I think at some point we'll have to solve the problem of what's good and what's bad. I think the challenge of it is, how do you create a system that can be trusted in a world in which many things are untrusted? And it seems like when we build something to try and use it safely and securely, inevitably there is that backdoor, there is that path, there is that motion that we didn't anticipate that allows the system to be used in a way that it wasn't designed in the first place. We really believe very strongly that every system, that whether it's a data center running a large bank's infrastructure, or it's the identity that we use to log on to a website that has critical or important information about us, that every system is going to have to be defended, both in terms of staying safe, but also shutting down and reducing the problem when it occurs. It is a little bit of a fatalistic view to say that everything can be breached, but in a lot of ways, it proves us wrong every time we believe that we've come up with the silver bullet that prevents things from going wrong in the system.
Erel, in your talk, you talked about the danger to infrastructure, the possibility that hackers could make all kinds of things physically happen in the world. Planes crashing, steel mills blowing up, all kinds of things like that. We know that that's possible. There hasn't been a lot of that done so far, but we must have a sort of a list of things that we're most worried about. I don't want to heighten the paranoia here, but what are the things we are most worried about, not only because of possible science fiction apocalyptic visions, but because of known vulnerabilities? What would be the things to worry about?
I hate to say it, but a lot of the things that we're worried about have already been hacked. We were worried about somebody hacking the SWIFT system for money transfer around the world, because the SWIFT system is the trust system that allows you to trust the network when you send something from one bank to another. Well, a while back, just recently, the SWIFT system was hacked, and nearly $980 million were being snatched from it by posing a set of identities and a set of transfers that were not real. We were worried that the pharmaceutical industry would be guarded. That's why we have the ISO 9000 about manufacturing procedures and everything else. When somebody was posing to be inside your system as the CEO or as the head of development, they had access to a variety of drugs, and they had the ability to change the makeup and the chemical makeup of many of these drugs. What people don't understand is that when you need to create harm, sometimes it's changing very few parameters that cause the harm. So what I'm saying is that there needs to be an alertness that's not only demanded by the state. Isabelle said that earlier. Each one of the people that are in a given industry or a given sphere need to be able to regulate themselves and share information about issues and best practices. And one of the things that we're offering in Israel, we're offering a cyber gym. Sometimes in order to train for a marathon, you need to practice, because if you start running a marathon without practice, then you're probably going to collapse after 20 kilometers. So what we're offering countries, organizations, is to create a situation where you could practice a little bit, see the dangers, understand, simulate what could happen, and then be able to be a little smarter about this. And at the end of the day, we're creating a circle of trust. Like-minded people that want to see the network secure, that want to see people safe, that are willing to exchange information. If you break the trust, you're outside the trust circle. But there needs to be trust if we're going to be able to protect ourselves.
Well, trust is a difficult thing in the world of defense, but particularly in the world of intelligence, which is what we're sliding into here. One of my friends, a longtime CIA guy, said, there's no such thing as sharing intelligence, there's only trading intelligence. In your world, the world you're talking about, we're talking about everybody basically buying into the same system. So we would know what you're doing, you would know what we're doing. Wouldn't that be a problem, just to put the kindest face on it bureaucratically?
I mean,
Isabelle?
it's basically creating a cybersecurity international safe house. When you're in a safe house, in order to, you need to bring some information, not all the information. There really needs to be a difference between type and token. You don't need to know which bank was hacked, when it was hacked, and how much money was stolen. But you need to know what worm or what Trojan horse was used, and that a bank was breached under that strategy that cost, let's say, $1.5 million in order to breach it. And if you can use it, it's not going to cost you $6 million to defend it. It's going to cost you $60,000 to defend it. And you'll be able to do it a lot faster. So what I'm talking about, and then if you use the information in a way that is causing me harm, I doubt that you'll get the information the next time.
Isabelle?
I think in the intelligence field, like in industry, you have cooperation and competition, of course. And so we all have to be aware that we need to cooperate, but also to have different, sometimes, interests. So there was a debate a few weeks ago, about the backdoors, you see, in the United States, and we imported this debate in France and in Europe. And at the CNIL level, we issued an opinion saying that even if there is a temptation to put backdoors everywhere, because it seems to help the access to sensitive information if needed, there is a huge danger to do this, because you endanger the security of the whole system by doing this, and you don't know exactly who is putting the back doors. So this is one thing. And again, speaking of competition or cooperation, you have to be aware that Europe has a word to say. And in the new regulation that we just adopted in the privacy protection, of course, the issue of security is a very important issue. And we reinforced this security obligation and all the sort of security devices in order to be in line with the new needs of our environment. So I hope that with this type of approach, Europe can be ready on one hand for better security, but on the other hand also confident on its principles.
But we really are getting to the fundamental problem here, and not just on cyber security, but on all kinds of security in Europe. There's always this jealousy, there's always this competition. After the recent terrorist atrocities here in France, we went back and we said, well, there wasn't enough cooperation between Belgium and France, there wasn't enough cooperation here, there, and everywhere. The level of cooperation needed to fight in a concerted way against cyber invasion, if you will, is much higher than that. And the potential for invasion of privacy is much greater than that. So how do you do it? I think Andrew, I think Illumio is looking at some ways you can address this. Tell us a little bit about what Illumio does when you go to a government agency, when you talk to people, to, as you said, to reduce the size of the battlefield, if you will.
I think there's actually something that comes out of the entire discussion, which is, it needs to be highlighted, which is when we fight any form of war, the very first thing that we do is not pick up a gun and shoot. It is not send the airplane off and say, drop the bombs. The very first thing that we do is we try and get an understanding of the landscape. We were talking in the green room before about when the President of the United States, somebody that obviously we spend a lot of money and a lot of time and effort trying to protect, goes to a stadium, a large venue, to give a speech. The Secret Service doesn't show up with the president for the first time when he walks in. They go weeks or months in advance. They get blueprints. They understand every inch of that facility, every centimeter of that facility. And the first thing they do is they get an understanding of the visual picture so that they understand what are the threat vectors, where does the president have to go, and the next thing they do from that visualization is then they start figuring out a strategy for how to protect him or her. And so what we find in the cyber world is that before you even worry about what are the right strategies, what do we have to protect, what are the highest value assets, if you simply walk into a government agency or a large enterprise and ask them one simple question, can you tell me where all of your applications and data are living today? Where are those servers and those virtual machines that they're living on? And how are they all talking to each other? You couldn't get a yes to that question no matter how many companies or agencies you spent time talking to. The ability to protect something does not start with what weapon you use to protect it. It starts with being able to enunciate an understanding of what it is, to be able to visualize how it's behaving, and then to develop a strategy. And so one of the things that Illumio does, one of the core things that we do is we provide an MRI-like capability. The same way that if you go to the doctor and say, I think I'm sick, the doctor doesn't just cut you open and try and find out what's wrong. That would not anymore. They use something like an MRI machine to be able to take very detailed pictures and understand what's happening, and from there diagnose the problem and then operate. What we do is we try and build that visualization and give an enterprise or agency the knowledge to understand what's happening inside of their world, and then from there begin to develop strategies. And part of what we do is enable them to implement those strategies for protection as well.
Erel?
So I like what Andrew's saying about intelligence. The other major element in winning a war is allies, figuring out who are your allies and who you could work with. And I want to remind you what happened after 9/11. After 9/11, a lot of governments and a lot of security organizations that in the past were not cooperating started to cooperate because they felt they had to. And the information that was flowing was much more effective because they understood that if they would have put together some of the intelligence in Germany and then the CIA, and even on the same soil as the United States between the CIA and the FBI, they would have had a much more comprehensive picture of what was going on. So even in the Middle East, where you would think that a lot of people are working just against each other, it's not about Arabs against Jews, it's about extremists against those that are willing to protect against them. So I can tell you, and I don't know if this was even discussed before, but when one of the large countries around us, oil company, was attacked in a big way by another country that was seeing itself as the enemy of that country.
You mean the Saudis were attacked by Iran? Is that what you're saying? Aramco?
Then you know, Israel was helpful, and cooperation has been established. And when ISIS is attacking from the east on Jordan, there's other countries that are cooperating as well. I think that if we're gonna, this is going to terror and less to the privacy of individuals and the democratic society, but I think democratic societies are being attacked, and we need to understand it. There needs to be an understanding that we are working amongst those that are willing to fight the various forms of extremism, and by extremism I mean by people that are trying to take people's life in order to make a point. And I think that we'll see a great need to work together, respecting the privacy, but yet cooperating and sharing information around different hacks of different kinds in the system that you have. Let me tell you this, 95% of the terror attacks that are being launched in the world today have very clear fingerprints on the networks a month or 2 or 3 or 4 before that, in a way that is sometimes frightening.
This is sort of a footnote to this whole thing, but just out of curiosity, since I have these experts with me, a few years ago, one of the most sophisticated worms ever developed was developed by Israel and the United States, the Stuxnet, which attacked the Iranian nuclear program very successfully for a while. But you mentioned several times the DNA of these attacks. There was a big concern at the time that Stuxnet could be disassembled by hackers elsewhere and used and turned against other enterprises, other people. Has that happened to your knowledge? I just don't know. This is not a question I know the answer to. But, you know?
You know, I think that, first of all, I read about this as well.
Right. Well, I'm not suggesting you were involved in this. It's a, although maybe.
No,
I mean, if you were involved, please tell us.
But I think that sometimes governments, in order to create a defensive strategy, that's what's called the blue line within your state, and they're what's called the red line outside your state. And even France was attacked by one or two countries lately. And in order sometimes to understand where it's coming from, you need to go outside the parameters, because the source is not at the gate, the source can be elsewhere. So when you have country-like strategies that are launched against you, you need to be able to act sophisticated. I mean, there's one example where one agency in the United States were having some work with North Korea beyond enemy lines. And actually they were worried about some nuclear strategy, something that the North Korean were working on. And they were seeing that the North Korean were launching an attack on Sony on a civilian level. So apparently it doesn't have anything to do with national security. But what people are realizing now, that there absolutely needs to be a sharing of information between, let's say, the NSA and Homeland Security, if real protection is something that the state could offer.
Isabelle?
Yeah, I mean, cooperation is absolutely needed, but we all have to be aware that it's a change of culture.
Oh, it's a radical change of culture.
It's a radical change of culture between the states, and also when you speak of partnership between public and private actors, I fully agree it's absolutely a necessity, but it's a huge, huge change. And I think it would be important that here we are in a place in which we have startups from all over the world. And startups usually are sometimes, you're not a startup, but sometimes they are very far away from this consideration, you know, security, data protection. This is something they want to deal with after, you know, once the service has started. It's not the key of their objective, but in fact, they should. So you should appeal, you should launch a call for this public and private cooperation on security and data protection here.
I think we're just about to run out of time. In fact, we just did. I want to thank you all for coming, and I just want to say on the question of startups, I think that what we've seen here is an imagination of the apocalypse, and startups are always the greatest source of imagination in this business. And let's hope that if anybody can figure out the way to avoid the apocalypse, they'll be able to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much.